Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Lit programme of South Asian Heritage Month. And we're joined today by author, poet, activist, and a whole host of many other wonderful, wonderful things, Maya Kalaria, who is the author of this wonderful, incredible, powerful collection, Half Woman, Half Grief. And we'll be talking about some incredible things today. We'll be talking about some really, really powerful themes to do with grief and loss and pain and healing and mysticism and how that really looks through the lens of South Asian identity and culture and our history as well. And I have been a fan of Maya's work for a very, very long time. And this book is an incredible love letter to your mother, isn't it, Maya? First of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am super excited to have this conversation, especially talking about the intersection between grief and mysticism, which I think a lot of people don't always talk about. But yeah, the book is a love letter to my mum, who died when I was 9 years old of leukemia. And I was a child, so it was childhood grief that I went through. And it wasn't addressed in the community. It wasn't addressed in my family. It was very much celebrated to just get on with things. You know, I had a lot of positive reinforcement when I was working hard, when I was just getting on with my life. But I wasn't encouraged to cry, and I wasn't encouraged to talk about how I felt about losing her. And I was devastated to lose her. And I've been devastated for many years. It was kind of frozen inside me. I had no one to talk to about it. And I've always been a writer. I've always been a poet, even when my mum was alive. She used to send my little manuscripts to publishers, even when I was like 7 and 8 years old. So she was always a fan of my writing. And when she died, I actually wrote one of my most important poems, actually, and placed it in her coffin. So my poetry has always been sort of laced with death and grief. And so as I continued through my life, I kept writing poems, and it was the one way that I could actually heal and put words to something through my body that I couldn't really express to people, because I couldn't really gauge whether people could actually handle my grief, and most of them couldn't, because if I spoke about my grief, their grief would come up, and they couldn't handle that. And I knew that even as a child, being quite highly sensitive. So the poems came about over time, and they were also a tribute and a love letter to my child self, who was just frozen in time and like limping along in life. In the book, I say that going through grief was like being shot in the leg with an invisible bullet. The wound was invisible, so no one could see it. So I was comparing myself to all of my friends and my family and my peers, and being like, why are they, you know, like thriving at life, and I'm struggling? And everything just seems so bleak and dark. And so the book was, it was me processing all of that, all of those emotions, which I often felt in private. And so when I actually published the book, it was really hard to share these really, really vulnerable parts of me. I mean, I am actually quite an emotionally private person. So to do something like this for my first my first published book, I was like, is this the right thing to do? But I knew it was. And I knew that I had to, it was almost a way of exhuming my mum, her memory, not, you know, not in a sort of gruesome way, but like her memory, because she'd been buried underneath everyone's denial. They'd just kind of like swept over her memory and just got on with life. And my dad remarried really quickly. So the book was like going, no, you know, she was the most fundamental, important person in my entire life. I was a mummy's girl, you know, she was my biggest fan. I was her biggest fan. I will not forget her, and I will not forget her identity and my identity as a South Asian woman. So that's,
and it was very much, I'm so sorry, carry on.
Oh no, it's okay. It's just kind of the premise of the book in a nutshell, basically.
And there's a bit here that I've I always have marked, and it's before you even get to your poems, and you've said, our society doesn't provide the correct tools to support people through grief, and our family did not have the vocabulary nor the emotional capacity to know or give us what we needed. In fact, my father, brother, and I didn't talk to each other about my mother for 20 years. And and that's even before you get to what essentially is you pour your heart out onto the page. And this is such a powerful read. And what I always say to people when I'm like raving about you and this work is that there are a lot of pieces of work that are commentaries on grief, on the experience and the language of grief. And if you've ever suffered traumatic loss in this way, and particularly in ways that intersect with your life in times where they weren't meant to, or perhaps at an age or a time in your life where you weren't meant to, or you were the only person you knew in your cohort or your age group that was going through that, so you're isolated through that experience. Often when you're accessing material around this, it's very, and people are expressing their experiences through it as well, you can sometimes feel very barged in on as someone that has that same trauma. This is nothing like anything I've ever read. And the only thing I can describe it to is grief is a thing with feathers, which it's an absurd, extraordinary book, and that only because it removes you from all reality. And this has a similar effect, but it grounds you completely. And it's split up into 4 parts. You have the unraveling, you have the surrender, you've got the excavation, and then you've got the resurrection. And what you really lovingly do is you take whoever is reading this, however they've been hurt, whatever their trauma is, particularly if it's grief, you take them by the hand and you lead them through what happened to you as a child. And there's something so tender about it because there's the language of you as an adult woman, like you say, exhuming all of these feelings that were so wrapped up in silence prior. But there's also this tenderness, and it's as though it's a love letter to your child, your younger self. And so as the reader, it's an extraordinary experience. I read it all in one sitting and I couldn't put it down. And by the end of it, you just feel it's transformative. It genuinely is. It's a really, really beautiful thing. And I think particularly for our culture as well, how do you think that has played a part in how that plays a part in grief, firstly, and then secondly, particularly within your situation? I know that there was a unique element there, if you're comfortable enough to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Oh, you've frozen a bit. Oh, you've come back. So in terms of, are you saying in terms of like my grief intersecting with being South Asian?
Yeah. And also I know that in the home as well, I know you said your dad remarried quite quickly, and then the identity and culture was almost lost in the home.
Yeah. So my family is Gujarati, and my dad and mum are both Indian Gujarati, and so they're both born in Africa. So they have a Gujarati culture, but it's also got strong elements of Uganda and Kenya. And when my mum died, I didn't have someone to look to that looked like me, especially a woman who could model what being an Indian Gujarati, a proud Indian Gujarati woman, because she was very confident, very proud, very sort of beautiful and elegant. I didn't have that anymore, and my dad literally got with one of my school friends' mums who's white English within 8 weeks. And well, that's when we found out about her within 8 weeks. It probably was quicker than that. So it was shocking for everyone involved, apart from him. He just he was happy with that. But we were catapulted, my brother and I, into this very white English home. And my dad assimilated really quickly into English culture. We lived in Barnsley, which is a very racist town. It was a very racist town at the time. It's like an ex-mining town, and we got a lot of racial abuse. So my dad assimilated, and then my brother and I were just kind of left to fend for ourselves. And apart from maybe seeing Indian family members like once or twice a year, we had to assimilate so that we could survive. And that's what we did. So it wasn't just grief of losing her, it was the grief of losing what she represented and the grief of losing my culture, my link to womanhood through the lens of being Indian. Because, I have a larger nose and I'm proud of it now, but like at the time, I absolutely hated it. I've had racialized body dysmorphia for years because my stepmom and my stepsister were petite, blonde, tiny noses, totally different to me. And so I felt like a complete alien. And then everything on, on social media, not social media, on TV and everything just didn't reflect me. So there was so much grief, which is obviously colonial. And we talk about that a lot. We have a podcast about it, but it's all kind of trickles from colonialism, basically. And so the book also refers to colonial grief because that's essentially what it was. It was, me having to assimilate into white culture.
Exactly. Like and that's such a powerful part of it, I think, because I mean, the loss of like you say, being a mummy's girl, the loss of your person, it's not just the loss of your person, it becomes this entire connection to who you are and this entire connection to culture. And what I found really powerful about the work that you do and sort of the advocacy that you do now in all of these social spaces is that it is centered around reconnecting to these ways that we perhaps don't have an understanding of fully because we've lost touch with so many of these practices and so many of these intuitive parts of ourselves that is actually really, really rooted in South Asian culture and South Asian heritage pre-colonialism. It's very natural for us to process trauma and grief in the ways that you talk about. And I found that really, really interesting. Just before I ask you to elaborate on that, we welcome questions for Maya, by the way. If you want to respond to anything that she's saying, and if you'd like to ask her to elaborate on a couple more things, because the mysticism side of Maya's approach to the grief process is really, really fascinating. And this is a conversation. You are welcome to join in. So please do post your questions and comments, and I will pull them through as best I can. But back to you, Maya.
Sure. So this is where the mysticism element comes in, because I talk a lot in my work about reconnecting. But I will backtrack a little bit. When I was younger, when I was really young, even when my mum was alive, I was a very mystical orientated girl. So I was incredibly drawn to the elements of the earth, nature. That's where I felt very connected, and my imagination was huge. So I could get lost in my own world, symbols and living creatures, animals and trees and ancestry. That was all very much very, very appealing to me. And so one of the only archetypes I've ever found to fit me was that of either a crone or a witch or a wise woman. Even when I was younger, one of my first birthday cakes was a crone, was like an old woman. And so I've always felt very drawn to that. And so as I grew up, I think that mysticism element disappeared because I had to become assimilated into sort of white English popular culture. But as I started reconnecting with my grief, I started reconnecting with Mother Earth again and all of the different elements, and my own mysticism and my own intuition, and the deeper mysteries of life. And I think one of the things that propelled me into mysticism furthermore was when my mum died, and I kept questioning, like, why has she why did this happen to her? And why did this happen to me? And why did this happen to my brother at this age? And I couldn't quite comprehend like what death was and why she had died. And like, because you're supposed to have your mum. That's what I've been told. And death wasn't even a thing that any of us spoke about. So when she died, I was like, what the heck is going on? I was kind of propelled into the underworld, just shoved into the underworld of darkness and bleakness, where all of my friends were like in the overworld. And then I was like, well, there needs to be a meaning to this, because I can't really go on. I don't have anything to go on if there's no meaning to what's happened. I had to have a meaning. And so I started to question things that maybe people wouldn't question at that age, like what is life? What is death? Why do we die? What happens after we die? And like kind of opening up to the bigger mysteries of life. And that's always been my path. Sometimes stronger than other times. When I was going through my teenage years, I think I was obsessed with, you know, the same thing that most people are obsessed with as a teenager, like, you know, getting a date, or like, you know, trying to be cool and all that kind of stuff. But like deep down, the thread that's always been in me has been mysticism. And when I talk about mysticism, I think there's many meanings to mysticism, but for me, it's like the deeper mysteries of life and the great unknowing that we will never know all of, but we can feel our way through and have connection to a world that is beyond this physical world. So I believe our intuition is us receiving messages from this realm that we cannot see. And I've always been a deeply intuitive, highly sensitive person. When I was growing up, that wasn't really celebrated by my family, especially when my mum died. It was very suppressed. My dad always used to kind of say, which is very derogatory. He was like, oh, you're living in cuckoo land. And I had a lot of shame around my intuition. I pushed it down. And actually, my intuition is the thing that's got me where I am now. It's going against everyone else's.
That's so strange, because our culture in general is one that nurtures intuition.
Yeah, it should be.
And that and it platforms intuition. You know, it was just always an implicit thing in families of like, oh, so and so's a bit psychic, and you're like, oh, okay, it's Wednesday, like, and it's just it's so matter of fact. It's like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, that's fine. Oh, I always have dreams and then they come true, and you're like, okay, cool. So you hungry? And it's just, and it was just this blanket statement of normal. It's this openness in South Asian culture that lends itself more towards these ideas of we don't know everything, and there are some things that can't be explained, and then with that comes like a hyper superstition. But it is lovely to sort of straddle both worlds, and I'm glad that this is something that you have started to lean into, because the absence of it during such a difficult time is something that no one should have to deal with, when it's something that comes so natural to our community.
Absolutely. And I think I was just from a family that just didn't. And I wonder whether it's intergenerational trauma, because my family are from Uganda. My dad's family came over as, well, essentially like refugees, like, you know, trying to find a better home. They were kicked out of Uganda and they were in survival mode, and my dad kind of just froze inside. So he wasn't even accessing his own intuition. And it was all about survival. And when you're in survival mode, it's quite hard to access your deeper intuition, because I think you need a certain amount of safety.
And when you're twice migrants, you know, your home's been broken twice. And so where does that sense of safety come from when the evidence is to the contrary, that you don't belong, that you will be booted out?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the main reasons that I realized that there was something much deeper is that after my mum died, I went through terrible family circumstances where I received abuse from my stepmom and from different family members, and emotional neglect. And there was just a catalogue of different hardships. And for some reason, I managed to get through it. And I don't know how. I really don't, because I was quite isolated. Like, I didn't really speak my inner truth to a lot of people. I was too afraid. I was really shy. I had CPTSD. And so there was some guiding force that got me through like the darkest times of my life. But I was in the darkness, and it's not like I was guided to the light straight away. I was guided while I was in the darkness. And actually that leads me to the first poem that I'd like to read, because it's literally about that time in my life. So
I think that would be wonderful. Let's bear with me a second. I'm going to remove myself.
Okay. I walk towards you in the dark because I know I can see. I do not need light. I need no hands to feel you. You are within and without me. Your sound is my beloved, and your voice hums my name. My eyes remain open, dense, tender. The giver of death, the taker of life. I trust your rhythm as I trust my own heartbeat. A child born from darkness does not need a map home. And so that poem was about finding my way through the darkness. And because I was plunged into the darkness from so young an age, I learned how to navigate through it. Yeah, and here's the illustration that the very talented illustrator Ellie Coates drew, where it's about seeing in the dark, especially on the right-hand side. And I learned to see in the dark, and I didn't need hands to feel my way because I was a child of darkness. And that's how it felt. And so I became really accustomed to the rhythms of the darkness and of death. It became very familiar to me, and I felt guided by a larger force than me. Are you back?
Hello, I'm back.
Hello.
Would you like to read another one, or would you like to read another one later?
I'll read another one later. I just wanted to kind of say more about the mysticism element of being comfortable in the darkness and with not knowing. And I think currently, with everything we're going through in this world, are we comfortable with not knowing what our next step is? Are we comfortable with trusting a higher power? And I think a lot of us struggle with that. I think there's a lot of panic around that. And I think, having been through grief from a young age, I had to learn to trust in the darkness without knowing what the end result would be. And even now I live like that. I live my life in a way that many wouldn't. I'm living quite nomadically at the moment.
I was going to say, please tell us how you're living at the moment, because this is brilliant.
So my partner and I just gave up our flat and our jobs and decided to go and live nomadically in a trying to decolonize, basically. So we're living with the rhythms of Mother Earth, and we're traveling around based on our intuition, and we're working online at the same time. So hence being here. But it's learning to trust in our intuition and our inner senses, and learning to commune with Mother Earth. So a huge part of our mysticism practice is to go out into nature and to connect and commune with Mother Earth and ground, and just commune with the elements as well. So earth, fire, water, and air. So these are practices that, like every earth honoring indigenous culture, including our own, has always been steeped in. If you travel far back, all elements of spirituality are like earth honoring. So this is kind of like stripping it all back and just going back to those mysticism roots, and trying to live that in our everyday life. And even the book, there's a lot of earth centered. There's a lot of elements there. There's earth and water and the river and rain, and all these different elements that I wanted to bring into grief.
Do you feel that that's maybe because perhaps not, it's not even a deliberate choice. Do you think maybe perhaps the nature of grief is because it's so primal, and it is so it aligns so acutely with these things that are unadulterated, ferocious, natural elements internally and externally?
Well, we all come from the earth and we go back to the earth. The earth takes the giver of death, was just in that poem. The taker of life, the giver of death. We have to surrender to this higher power that we cannot control. My mum, she was born of this earth. Our elements make up our body. We're made of like different elements of the earth, and we go back to the earth, and we have no control over that, at least in our physical senses. So grief is primal because the earth is taking that person back that we absolutely love. And Mother Nature, as much as she is nurturing and giving and loving, she is death as well. She is the storm, she is the fire, the wildfires, she is the giver of death. And so I feel, and we were saying this earlier, I feel like we're not eloquent in death, in the language of death and the language of Mother Earth, which is so intertwined. And that, as you said, grief is primal because it takes us back to our core, like why we're even here. It makes us question who we are and our soul's purpose. It just strips everything away. And it is visceral, and it's like you feel it as a pain, a literal pain. A lot of us get ill because our bodies are responding to that grief. So it's something we cannot control, and we cannot control Mother Earth. We cannot control nature. We think we can as humans, but that's a very colonial sort of objectifying,
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
like idea. But really, in earth honoring Indigenous practices, we are living in a reciprocal relationship with the earth. We are honoring the earth. We are respecting her cycles. Winter is as important as summer. Winter is death. Summer is life. And we can't have summer without winter. And so
both.
Yeah,
this is what you always say, and okay, everybody, this is what I tell people when I'm raving about Maya and her work to people, and whenever there are conversations being had about grief and loss and pain and all of the difficult and barbed and fractious things that we go through as a society and as people, that we don't talk about, that we parcel away and we don't talk about openly. And Maya put this so beautifully once, when we were in another discussion, and she said, you can only feel as much light as you have dark, and that the two principles, the two things are symbiotic, and they rely on one another. And this aligns so beautifully with what you're saying about winter and summer and Mother Earth being, and understanding that it's not just this nurturing, I give you everything. It is, I'm also the bringer of death. How are you? Like I give and I take away, and understanding this cyclical nature of things. And I think that we don't want to deal with the ending of things, and because we don't want to deal with the ending of things, we are like children when we are like feckless children when we encounter these very raw or these very raw elements of being human, and when we have to deal with them and we don't know what to do. We're just flawed. We're completely flawed when it happens, because we, like you say, we don't have the language to prepare. We don't have the language we're not equipped in our societal structures to handle this animalistic thing in the right way. And I think it's really powerful what you're saying, going back to these natural principles and understanding the relationship between life and death, and that one needs the other, is key.
Absolutely. And I think then there's this other part of mysticism where, because we're not eloquent in death, we assume death is a complete ending, that there's just life and then there's death. And if someone goes, even though on some level we are religious or we've been brought up thinking about like the spiritual realm, I don't think we apply it necessarily when a person dies. So we are just flawed. it's this visceral thing that takes over. We are absolutely devastated. And I think somewhere within that, we forget that we still have a connection to that being. That being was always a soul, always. And they took a form of physicality, and then the physicality was composted back into the earth, and the soul is still there. The soul is always there, and we will always be there. And because we're part of a greater cosmos, a greater energy. And so I think our ability to communicate with beings that are in other realms, I think we all have a lot of people have a fascination with it, or they've seen something, or they've felt something before, but I feel like we're still not eloquent in that language. And I think, and I keep like referring to this, but I do think earth honoring indigenous spiritual people were much more in communication with their ancestors. They were much more used to channeling, channeling other realms, other beings, and yeah, mediumship and things like that. It wasn't seen as this weird thing. It was just normal, because death was seen as a transition. And so I come from a Hindu family, and reincarnation is the norm. And yet, for some reason, even though Hinduism really believes that, we believe in reincarnation, when it comes to speaking about death, it's like we're completely flawed.
Oh yeah, you don't. Yeah.
It's like, there's no smooth.
Well, my mum couldn't hear the word. She couldn't hear the word death or die, and she would just go no, 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 and we couldn't talk about it. And so when my father died, when I was 23, 24, it was there had been no conversations about death, none in the house. And so prior to that, I'd lost my friend earlier in the year. So my experience through it had been a very personal, solitary experience. And then the family started dealing with something in the December that we were passengers. We were passengers throughout that experience. And it was just, you barrel through it, and it is just one trauma after another. And that's what happens when we lock ourselves away from any dialogue around this. And it is so important to just talk openly about this, because talk openly about this in the same way that we do life. Because it is, it is a life that you loved, a life that was part of yours, and part of this process is honoring that life. And I wish that I could go back in time and talk to myself in my early 20s and just be like, it's okay, we'll figure this out much later, but I'm just going to give you a hug now. Everything's fine. Don't worry. Because it's just, we had to cobble this together, didn't we? And it's an extraordinary thing. And I love that you are out here doing this work and having these very, very difficult conversations, sometimes, in ways that make people uncomfortable. But this is where you have to agitate that space, because there are generations coming after us. There are young children who are vulnerable, who don't know how to have these complex conversations. And you work with children and you've worked with young people anyway, haven't you, within your career? And so, and you can really see that in your work, and you can really see that in any speaking events that you do as well, because there is that sensitivity there to how we need to be framing language around trauma, language around and shame around accessing what you feel, and when you're going through something scary and terrible and horrible, that here is, creating space for those conversations to happen and creating safety for those conversations to happen. And I think all of that really pulls into the work that you do, and it's why it's this beautiful balance of starkly addressing trauma as an adult, but then carefully taking care of the child as well that experienced all of these things.
Absolutely. And I believe that in our society and our culture as South Asians, unresolved grief is behind the majority of our issues. It's unresolved grief. And I'm not just talking about losing a person, I'm talking about losing a country. I'm talking about losing our sovereignty. You know, like when India was colonized and when the partition happened, and then when we had to move, and then when we had to move again because some of us were kicked out, and then you know, everything is a loss. Everything is a loss, and we are not. We struggle so much to accept that loss, and then it builds up, and it's like little paper cuts, and then it just turns into gaping wounds, and then we pass it on. We pass it on to our children, and it's the thing is about being highly sensitive and being a mystic and like picking up on energy. I feel someone's energy before I really speak to them. So they might be saying, "Oh, I'm really like great and everything," and I will just feel this tsunami of grief because it's their grief that they're carrying in their heart and their body that they do not want to acknowledge because they're so afraid. And one of the biggest things I want to say to people is, I know it's scary. No one likes to allow themselves to feel sad. But if you just allow yourself even a short amount of time to just let those tears flow, you can shut yourself away. I used to do it in the shower. I used to like just cry in the shower, just go somewhere like to a river, or, you know, go somewhere in nature, and you can be alone.
There's a lot to be said about water, isn't there?
Yeah. You will feel so much better even after that first outburst. You know, it's the worst that can happen is you'll feel sad for a bit. It will pass. And then it might come again. You know, grief is cyclical, and we are humans. We're always going to have sadness. Like, we can't just get rid of that. Like, we live in this world. There are losses every day, but you will become more adept at the language of sadness, and it won't be such a massive problem. It'll be like, oh, I'm a bit sad. I'm gonna cry it out, and then I'll let it flow on. And, you know, next time I'm sad, I'll do the same thing. That it's a muscle. It is a muscle. And I think to become friends with our sadness, and to talk to others about our sadness, it is
so important. And we don't do it enough, and we haven't been socialized to do this. And not just in South Asian culture, but we haven't been socialized to do this in British culture. To be friends with your sadness, my God, no, absolutely not. We don't talk about that, and we're never sad. And we're cheerful people, and we're really great. Let's have a G&T,
really,
you know. And I would never say no to a G&T, but still, you know, we can be sad and have a G&T.
This country has an alcohol problem because of running away from its
exactly.
Yeah, we'll not talk about it, and then we wonder why we've got these like addictions, and like why people look at Britain and go, why do we, you know, have these issues? And, you know, it's like, yeah, we're running away from our collective.
Well, look at football hooliganism for one. The ridiculous phenomenon that is that, because we don't know how to process our emotions about anything.
No, and then it gets projected. This is the thing, when we do not deal with our sadness and our grief in a healthy way, we just project it onto other people, and we project it onto the world around us. And the thing is, it won't help because you can't run away from your sadness.
No,
you just can't. It's one of those things. It's an inevitability that it will come back. And, you know, the book is kind of a testament to that, because I did try and run away like everyone does, you know, and then this grief just kept coming back, and I was like, oh, you know, it just came through in these poems. And, you know, 20 years later, after my mum had died, I had to address it, and I'm so glad I did, because it's become a vehicle, hopefully, to help other people address theirs.
It really does, and it's a incredibly powerful, beautiful thing. It really is, and I think you're exactly right. Grief does not dissipate. If you don't address it initially, it does not go away. It demands to be heard, and it demands your attention, and it demands your focus. And you can delay it, but you will not outrun it. You will not outrun it. And you have to go through that process where, exactly like you said earlier, you have to meet it and you have to make friends with it. And when you learn to make friends with it, the horror of the situation goes away. And when the horror of it disappears, then you will be able to deal with what you're left with. And you'll be able to piece together what you're left with. And this book does that so beautifully. It communicates that so beautifully. I would love it if you could read some more for us.
This one actually leads into that really well. Okay. I will carry my broken heart into the desert, cradled through lands of bleak nothingness, with not a soul or barren tree in sight. There will be no more illusions, no mirage. I will ride into sand wide open, just to lay under the midnight sky and bury my heart in warm dunes, listening to its faint drum beating in the stillness, just to witness the stars playing hide and seek with this, my most beloved treasure. And upon the light of dawn, upon awakening, just to rise and hear it beating a little bit stronger. And that's kind of how it feels. That's kind of like a bit of the journey, you know. It's kind of this, you're in this bleak desert, you know. That's how grief feels, and you're isolated and alone, and it's really barren. And I think when you strip away the illusions and the mirage, which we were just talking about, like the illusions of I'm happy, everything's great, if we just accept, like, I'm sad, I'm going to let go of all these illusions that I've been trying to build around myself, that's when you can really start to heal. Riding into sandstorms with eyes wide open, it is quite a visceral image, because it's like all this sand that, and it is painful, but that's okay. We will survive. We survive pain all the time. It's okay. We're human. That's what we're here to do as well, you know. And then kind of taking my heart and burying it in the warm dunes, and just like sleeping with that, and then waking up the next day and like hearing that it's like the heartbeat is like a little bit stronger. And time is such a beautiful healer of wounds as well. And so like that poem was like this journey of like just kind of healing from my grief. Yeah, using natural earth-based metaphors.
It's beautiful, really, really beautiful, and really tender as well. For such a powerful, violent thing, you've written about it and you write about it so tenderly. It's really extraordinary. I've just we've got a question from House of Bill Moria. Love House of Bill Moria, by the way. Love them. Love them. I was literally like, oh my God, you're watching. How exciting. Thank you for reading. I found it deeply moving. Is having this resilience to see in the darkness what allowed you to go through the abuse and adversities, and coming out with strength and able to see?
100%. So when my mum died, when my dad remarried, I underwent narcissistic abuse from my stepmom, and I went through a lot of bullying from my stepsister and my stepmom and my brother and quite a few people. I was the scapegoat of the family, and if anyone reads about narcissistic systems in the family, there's always like different roles associated with each child. So I was the scapegoat, and so not only did I have grief, but I had all this abuse, which then it turned into complex trauma basically, and I had no one to talk to about it. So I was in the dark, like in the very pits of the dark, you know. There was absolutely no one to talk to about it. And I think just as Shilpa was saying, it was the abuse and the kind of the darkness that it propelled me into that allowed me to, I had no choice but to feel my way through. Like it was kind of, I had to become very accustomed to like living in that bleakness. There was no light. I kind of had to just get on with the darkness. And so when you're in the darkness and there's only like a very small flicker of light, your sight becomes really intense, like your insight and your foresight. You know how they say when you can't see very much, like all of your other senses kind of blow up, and you're kind of like your hearing gets better and your intuition gets better and all these things. That was exactly what happened to me. I just became like very, very sensory in all of my other kind of ways of feeling, if that makes sense. And my intuition,
100%.
it just kind of started picking up on people's energy and working through life in that way. And so I am really grateful, despite it being a really difficult time, because I've come out with almost these superpowers of being able to like
It's like
do things in
honed
life.
these, incredible senses. And
Yeah.
you're like, I'm Trauma Avengers. How are you? It's amazing.
It's honestly, I do say, and it sounds quite dramatic, but hey, we're in this conversation already. But it's like when you've got nothing to lose, you actually have a lot of power. Because I lost
100%.
everything. I didn't have anything. I didn't have any like family members that I could turn to. I had some people that were quite supportive, but I still couldn't really talk to them. And because I had nothing to lose. And so like that created like extraordinary kind of gift that just came from my own co-creation with life and just becoming a sort of stronger version of myself in a way, but not kind of stronger in the sense of pushing everything away, but stronger that I could deal with the pain and like feel the pain.
It's incredible though, because it seems that it's been very galvanizing, incredibly galvanizing, and in a way whereby it's not something that you've gone, it happened, I've overcome it, it's fine, everything's fine. You've actually gone, this is difficult and this is horrifying, and I'm in the process of overcoming. This is not, this is a developing process. It's like anti-racism, isn't it? Like it doesn't end. This is, there is no finite point that we reach and go, I've achieved grief. I'm healed. And it doesn't work that way. And it's the fact that you're so big-hearted and open, and that this is actually an experience that, that stuck with me for so long, that you can only feel as much light as you felt dark, that you've said. And you are a testament to that you push further and further into these difficult, uncomfortable spaces and uncomfortable parts of yourself and your experiences. And you can see how it gets you closer to light as well. You can see it, you can see it. And since I've known you, I can see the change in you. The more that you push yourself to do this work, it's an extraordinary thing to witness. And it is a testament to how this real healthy conversations around grief and trauma and what we go through, and then what is on top of that as communities of color, what is on top of that as South Asian communities that went through this horrific ordeal of partition, and twice migrant communities within that canon of that language of that story of history that is hidden, completely hidden. And so the trauma that you are carrying isn't just of a people that were displaced and were occupied and were horrendously treated, and so many of whom died. It is the trauma of a people whose pain was suffocated, whose pain was hidden, whose pain and grief was suffocated away because it was not acknowledged, and it was not given any dignity and any respect. And so we have in our bones this legacy of silence about our trauma, about our pain. And so we need people like you. We need people like you to help us to do the work, because everything is geared towards going, I'm going to shut myself in a cupboard and we don't want to deal with this, because we don't know how, and we don't have the language to start getting into it as well, because we're only it's only 3 generations of what has happened. And so I think really now it's our generation that's piecing together all of the deficits and trying to fill all the gaps and trying to lovingly bring forward all of the history that we need to hold on to, and just respect and honor and love everyone that came before us, but make sure that we're building a world for everyone that comes after, that includes healthy, open, frank conversations about our pain, and that dignifies our pain. Because I think through the work that you're doing and the way that you write, you afford our pain dignity. And that's not something that we have a lot historically and societally. We don't do that. as women especially as well. We don't do that.
Yeah, I agree. And it makes me think of the last poem, which actually is about grieving together and different generations of grief, and intergenerational grief. So I'd love to read that as a kind
Absolutely.
of response. These are not new tears. Mourn with me. Wear black, wear white. These are not new tears. They once fell from you and me and drained down through the streets, into sewers, into rivers, oceans. Mourn with me. They sat there sedentary, perfectly covered by the darkness, until it was time. Mourn with me. It's time for old rain to fall down new faces. So that poem is quite multi-layered, and this is the illustration that goes with that. And it's hard to explain all of the layers of that poem, but even the wear black, wear white, it refers to race, but it also refers to different mourning attire. So in Indian, in a lot of Hindu culture, we wear white for funerals. In British culture, they wear black, and in different cultures, they wear different coloured clothing, or different adornments, and they have different rituals. And so this was referring to that as well. But then there was the cyclical nature of grief, portrayed through water and the cycles of water through the earth, and how it falls down into sewers and rivers via the rain, then the oceans, and then it evaporates again into the clouds, and then it comes right back down again. And so it kind of talks about all of that and intergenerational trauma, because it's the same pain that we've all been experiencing. It's just recycled, in this kind of very earth-based cyclical way. So yeah, a lot of kind of different meanings to that poem. I think I've lost you again, but you will probably be coming back. Hello.
I'm back. Hello. That was really, really beautiful. Really beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's gorgeous. That poem, it really speaks to the universality of pain, of our pain, just as people, as women, as South Asian people as well. And it is absolutely extraordinary.
Whenever we feel grief, it is a feeling that someone else has felt. That's the thing. It can feel so isolating, and yet it is such a commonality between us. So my grief has the same essence as your grief. We could be grieving over different people and different things, but it's the energy is the same, and we share that. And I think what's happened in our current society and our culture is, we've become isolated, and it's become a very individualistic system. And going back to, and I'll say it again, like earth honoring indigenous practices, and you know, I probably said it about 5 times now, but kind of community, grieving in community can be so healing. I'm sure for many people who have been to funerals and wakes and have grieved and cried alongside other people, there is something powerfully healing about that, powerfully healing. And just grieving in community and having them hold space for you while you grieve. And I just strongly believe in the communal power to grieve and the collective power to grieve, which I think we're all going through now. We're grieving environmentally. I mean, the earth is on fire. Goodness knows what's going to happen, you know, in a few years' time environmentally, if we're going down the route that we're going. You know, we're grieving a lot of losses. A lot of our plant life and our animal life have died. You know, it's huge what we're going through. And then COVID, you know, like for many of us, racism, like waking up to the grief that we feel about colonial grief and racial grief, racial trauma. There is a huge amount to grieve. And I think this is where we're at right now. We need to grieve together.
I agree. Oh, we've got a comment here. This looks like a great book to explore. I run a podcast on mental health and well-being and would love to read more from the South Asian background like myself. I'm actually covering grief as a topic next week, and I would love to see if I can get an ebook copy from somewhere. Do you have ebook copies available? And where can we buy a book, actually, most importantly?
Yes, so I do have ebook copies available, and I have paperback copies, and it's on my website, which is mayakalaria.com. So it's spelt exactly how you see it here, and just .com, and you will find all of that on my website, as well as other talks that I've done about grief, racial trauma, decolonizing. There's a link to mine and Natasha's podcast, because we have a podcast together called the Decolonial Podcast. So there's a whole host of work on there, and the ebook.
Love that. Okay. Oh, we actually have a follow-up to this. I would love to speak to Maya about her book on grief, if possible, for the podcast, How to Be, covering mental health and well-being. As a South Asian myself, I would love to hear it from a different perspective, if possible.
Yes, of course. Just email me via the website. There's a contact form, and I will get back to you about that. And it sounds fantastic. Thank you for asking.
Love that. Where can we stalk you? Where can we follow you?
Okay, so on Instagram, I do a lot of grief and decolonizing work. So it's at Maya Kalaria on Instagram, and then my website. I will be creating a Twitter soon, but I haven't done so far. It intimidates me, so I will do it one day.
I feel like I've been tagging the wrong Maya Kalaria on Twitter for about a year. I am so sorry to whoever you are.
It could be me. I just haven't seen it because I'm a bit of a ghost on there. So
love it. Love it. Oh, thank you, Arvin. That's really nice of you. That's really weird. Oh, Daniel popped in before. Hang on, wait, look.
Oh.
Great to be here, Daniel Edmund. Love it. Love that.
Thank you, Daniel.
Daniel is my friend. He was a guest on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. He's excellent. Yeah. He's an excellent person. Really but yeah, I will any more the comments and questions that we get in, you can DM them to us. You can DM them to Maya if she's comfortable with that. Are you comfortable with that? If not, we can field questions. But thank you so much for your time. This has been incredible, absolutely incredible. And there's so much to unpick here and so much to talk about. And I feel like we can go on for hours and hours and hours. But we will actually be seeing the two of us on the program as well, on the wider South Asian Heritage Month program and the LIT program. So we will be back on
Sunday the 15th.
Sunday the 15th. See, this is why we love it. It's very organized. Sunday the 15th.
Yep. So we're doing a live episode of the Decolonial Podcast where we bring even more fire, even more healthy rage. We talk about
a bit of healthy rage.
We talk about our shared history, our South Asian history, and Black history, Indigenous history, and healing that, and talking honestly and truthfully about our uncomfortable past. And so, yeah, we'll be having a live episode on Sunday the 15th.
And it's called Truth and Reconciliation. Let's talk about our colonial past. And we will be, and I think part of this entire LIT program really for this year is about reflecting what world are we reflecting back to children, and then what that means for them in terms of what they can dream for themselves. And part of that includes not just what we're saying through storytelling, but what we are reflecting back in terms of giving a true and accurate picture of our history, a complete picture of our history, and having frank, open conversations like this, and having people like Maya who are allies in this fight, in having these open conversations without judgment, without shame, without guilt, without any of those prickly and barbed things that are things that we've had to work through in order to access our own vulnerability and our own pain, and we've often come to rather late in life. And it is about what world intentionally we want to build for all of the little people that we love and everybody else that comes after us, and one that gives everyone the tools that they just need, that we just leave them behind for them and go, hi, we love you all, here it is, you're just great. And I'm a massive fan of Maya's writing, and I always have been, but the work that you do and the experience that you have, particularly with youth work as well, I think is key here. It really is, in terms of how we build this framework and how we create safe spaces for these conversations to happen, particularly with vulnerable younger people who are going through these things where, like you were saying, when it happened in your life, you feel so isolated and you feel so alone. And I hope that is not going to be the case anymore. And I hope that people know that there are people out there in the ether who are here for them, and or that there are spaces where this dialogue can occur, and that there is no shame around it at all, and it's just a blanket of love. And thank you so much for your time. Honestly, this has been really powerful and really transformative, and as always, it's a pleasure. It really is.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who is tuned in to the online discussion now and who will be listening to this in the near future and is streaming it as well. Thank you so much for being part of this important conversation.
Thank you, guys. We're going to go now, but we hope you have a really good evening. The rest of the literary events for next week, registration for those will be released on Monday morning, and we'll be doing a video over the weekend. We're going to have a day off tomorrow. It's a change in our programming. And then our final event for this week is going to be in partnership with Penguin Random House. It's going to be Mohsin Zaidi's memoir, Dutiful Boy, interview on Sunday. So don't miss that. And then Monday, we've got a whole new week of events for you. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. You're all fabulous. Happy South Asian Heritage Month. Bye.